Chapter 1. On the subject of psychology. Paragraph 1. The current importance of the question about the subject of psychology. The question of the subject of study is not only the first, and today perhaps the most difficult, of the large theoretical questions of psychology, but also a question of vital practical importance. The issue is that the representations of the subject of psychology, which have been held and accepted until now, turned out to be largely mistaken. Merely pointing to psychological processes, thinking, memory, imagination, feelings, is insufficient for constructing a psychological science. These processes are studied not by one psychologist, but by many scientists, and in these very processes, the boundaries of various sciences are not clearly defined. It is necessary to have clear criteria to distinctly understand what can and should be studied by a psychologist, what has perennially been the domain of other sciences, what tasks should be solved by psychology, and which should only seem psychological but in reality are not, and psychology neither can nor should solve them. When there are no criteria for what pertains to psychology, and only to it, there is a facile substitution of the subject of psychology with the subjects of other sciences, physiology, theories of knowledge, logic, ethics, etc. This leads to the fact that the theoretical elimination of psychology, leaving us defenseless in the face of the complexities of our own mental life, leads to the misdirection of psychological phenomena related to other areas of knowledge, psychologizing of social phenomena, history, theory of knowledge, linguistics, pedagogy, etc. As a result, the explanation of psychological phenomena is sought outside psychology, and the explanation of psychological phenomena in physiology. In many cases, such attempts at explanation lead to explanations that remove undesirable phenomena by steering them in a neuropathological direction. The question of the subject of study being that of a separate science is a major theoretical question, but it is not always and not at all levels the same for the development of each science or of equally practical significance. We in psychology must not relent in our statements that many exact sciences, mathematics, physics, chemistry, biology, and others, would be enriched without defining their subjects. That corresponding psychology has become an experimental science, widely spread and applied in various areas of practical life, also not being held back in defining its subject. That explaining the subject of science is more the job of philosophy, and not the science itself, etc. In mathematics, physics, chemistry, and many other sciences, the system of propositions defining the subject of a discipline is so well developed that possessing it, a novice intuitively senses the subject of these sciences and recognizes their relevant boundaries. In disciplines that have reached a certain level of development, the question of their subject matter is indeed more of a philosophical question, more important for the methodology of science and world understanding than for any specific research. But in contemporary psychology, another situation prevails. Psychology has become an experimental science, has obtained a diverse and extensive application in practice, and this is indeed a significant achievement. However, the psychological experiment is developing slowly and in the most important areas and directions. For example, in studies of needs, feelings, will. In the psychology of personality, it is just taking the first steps. And in other areas of successful experimental investigations, it is still, in fact, rather rough. If we take into account the breadth and dispersal of psychological research, the huge success that has been achieved in this area in general, the total time spent on experimenting in psychology, which is now more than a century, and compare all this with the results, then the latter seem disproportionately small, and what's more important, it would be strange, indeed paradoxical, to further elaborate on deep theorizing and possibilities of various experimental, yes, even non-obvious, experimental directions in psychology. Concerning the significant number and character of unexplained phenomena, so to speak, the empirical character of many theoretical constructs, all this ultimately raises the question, are we not misled by many non-psychological and undoubtedly outstanding researchers on the wrong path? Should this be considered widespread confusion? When empirical research, equipped with advanced devices and mathematical methods of material processing, can successfully develop without theoretical representations or its own subject matter, refusing more or less explicitly formulated hypotheses, similar empirical studies maintain the same general orientation. After all, the point is not to explain the subject of psychology, but to exclude it and make it the subject of purely scientific study. As for the wide practical application of psychology, it is better to refrain from direct, unequivocal conclusions about its scientific foundation and its real scientific value. A small amount of practical work, which incidentally stands out in psychology, is actually idealistic in nature. It is useful for enthusiasts, but has only a remote relation to the subject of psychology. Besides, in psychology, as in any other area, practice in the initial and fairly wide borders can be handled as a so-called living experience, without profound theoretical work in the proper sense of the word. In everyday practice, many psychologists work, and not unsuccessfully, as doctors, sociologists, engineers, pedagogues, and many others. The question is, can specialist psychologists do, or not do something more than these practitioners? There is a growing concern that the strong empiricism of research, based on sophisticated devices and mathematical methods of processing materials, could develop successfully without theoretical representations or about its subject matter. Should we just accept more or less explicitly stated hypotheses, such empirical research retains the same general orientation. Indeed, the goal is not to explain the subject of psychology, but to exclude it and make it the subject of purely scientific inquiry. What concerns the broad practical application of psychology, it would be better to refrain from straightforward conclusions about its scientific basis and actual scientific value. A small share of practical work, which incidentally stands out in psychology, is truly idealistic in nature. Although beneficial for enthusiasts, it only has a tangential relationship to the subject of psychology. Moreover, in psychology, as in any other field, practice at the initial and fairly broad boundaries can be managed as what might be termed living experience, without in-depth theoretical work in the strict sense of the term. In daily practice, many psychologists work, and not unsuccessfully, as doctors, sociologists, engineers, educators, and many others. The question is whether specialist psychologists can do, or not do something more than these practitioners. Mechanisms of psychological phenomena and where to seek these mechanisms must be understood. Clearly, knowing these mechanisms can make the subject matter more accessible than allowing experience and practice unequipped with theories. It is also clear that every psychological study should be directed towards learning the mechanisms of psychological phenomena. But where should these mechanisms be searched for? Today, the majority of psychologists seek these mechanisms in the physiology of the brain. Since the objective world reflects in the psyche, and the subject in their activity is guided by this reflection, many psychologists search for mechanisms of psychological activity in the laws governing perception, in the beginning of cognitive connections between objects. This means that for them, psychology does not exist in logic, or in general, is not psychology. If we admit that such orientation implies that psychological phenomena have no inherent psychological mechanisms, and that psychology is confined to one phenomenon, then we must openly admit that psychology does not constitute a separate, independent science because no science studies, i.e., only describes, phenomena. Science studies essentially not the phenomena themselves, but what lies behind them and produces them, which are the mechanisms. If we think that physiology can indeed explain certain psychological phenomena, then to study and understand them, we must turn to the corresponding section of physiology. If we think that logic can actually explain psychological processes, for instance, psychological thinking and its possibilities at various developmental stages, then they should study genetic foundations, forming the logic in people's minds, forming partly genetic, and then various logical constructions in the consciousness of a child, in the development of human society. In the first case, we become physiologists. In the second, logicians. Let not just logicians, but genetic logicians. But in both cases, psychological activity proves to be merely the domain of only phenomena, not an independent subject of study. And it would be inconsistent to say at the same time that we are engaged in psychology, and in general, that such a science as psychology exists. If many psychologists still say that psychology, in fact, talks about one thing, but the actual convictions are different, they imply that what refutes psychology does not preserve the intuitive certainty that it exists. However, theoretical reasoning, something boundless, and if psychologists go into physiology or genetic logic, it is not to study the processes and laws of physiology or logic, but with a certain confidence and hope that there they will find solutions to psychological problems. Now, this issue about the subject of study is the most nourishing, the most practical and urgent question of our science. Modern psychology does not have a strict framework of knowledge, structured in such a way that its study naturally leads to intuitive understanding of its subject and tasks. All the definitions, descriptions, and indications of the subject of psychology that have been proposed up to now have proved not only insufficient, but simply inconsistent. Along with this, psychology has found itself at the intersection of many sharp and pressing questions of modern humanity, arising in connection with the scientific technological revolution on the one hand, and the entrenchment of ideological confrontations between the new and the old world on the other. In the face of these grand challenges, psychological practice, unaided by a robust theory, proves to be ineffective. And if we do not want to remain in the position of the helpless, stumbling in attempts, frequently slipping into significant yet scattered facts, we must first sort them out, of course considering the experience of errors and individual significant achievements, which in fact constitutes the subject of psychological study. Paragraph 2. Inadequacy of traditional representations about the subject of psychology. If we discard the insubstantial variants that seemed more a means of expression than of substantive content, then throughout the history of psychology there have been only three fundamental notions guiding the subject matter: soul, consciousness, behavior. The soul as a subject of study. The soul was acknowledged by everyone until the beginning of the 18th century, before the main representations solidified, and then the first system of psychology of the contemporary type emerged. Representations of the soul were mainly idealistic, but there were also materialistic theories of the soul. They began with the ideas of Democritus and described the soul as a material entity, particles of which, round, smooth, and unusually active, penetrated between larger and less active atoms, pushing them into motion. The soul was considered the cause of all processes in the body, including what were termed soulful movements. A fundamental flaw of this attractive materialistic representation of the soul lay in the fact that the soul was considered a special cause, the primary cause of these movements. This meant all influence on the body were mere reactions to which the soul could respond as it wished. And why it wished so was not further explained, depending solely on itself, from its nature, and beyond any explanation. Thus, in the role of the first principle even materialistically represented, the soul divided sharply into systemically insurmountable and inexplicable principles with respect to the external world. And when by the end of the 18th century the essentialized materialistic worldview had crystallized, speculation about the primordial cause ceased, and the soul, as a subject, lost all trust of scientists. The soul, as an explanation, but itself inexplicable, gave way to scientifically observable phenomena, being sought after less and less. The consciousness as a subject of psychological study. The place of the soul was taken by phenomena that we practically observe in ourselves, turning to our internal psychic activity. This includes our thoughts, desires, memories, etc., which each individual knows personally and which, like the facts of this internal experience, are something unquestionable. John Locke, who could be considered a foundational proponent of this understanding of the subject of psychology, was correct in pointing out that unlike the soul, consciousness phenomena are something unassuming, an empirical fact, and in this sense also the indiscussible facts of internal experience, just as are the facts of external experience studied by other sciences. At the beginning of the 18th century, from the phenomena of consciousness, its more durable part, the images of the external world, was selected. These images were laid down on their simpler elements, sensations. In the next step, emotions and feelings were also depicted as reflections of internal states of the organism, as combinations of organic sensations of pleasure, displeasure. The overall mechanism of associations allowed combining various sensations into more complex images and feelings, linking them with physical movements into so-called habitual movements and habits. Thus, all daily life began in the cognitive sphere, and then in the sphere of emotions and will, was represented, of course only theoretically, as processes of formation and change of associations with actions. Thus, in the middle of the 18th century, an important milestone for the history of psychology was marked by David Hartley, D. Hartley's conceptualization of the first scientific form of psychology, the English empirical associationist psychology. Its historical significance lay in the fact that here, psychology first asserted itself as an autonomous area of knowledge, covering all aspects of psychic life previously considered in different branches of philosophy: general theory of the soul, theory of knowledge, ethics, rhetoric on affects, and medicine, study on temperaments. For the greater history, the main merit of this psychology lay in the fact that it spread a natural scientific, but non-mechanistic, worldview regarding the realm of the soul, and in its broadest sense, protecting democratic ideas in shaping all psychological capabilities in individual experience. The history of this classic bourgeois psychology indicates that soon after the construction of its framework, the supporters began to doubt its scientific validity. Different sides of the system were challenged, but ultimately the fatal for it turned out to be the question of the possibility of objective research of consciousness phenomena. This question led to a split, because only an ideal way, through the comparison of inner experiences of consciousness, had validity. However, actual realization of this idea, since in experiences there is nothing above what is apparent, was not feasible. Others, like H.F. Herbart, hoped to compensate for the absence of experiment and real analysis with conditional measurement of representations and then calculating their interactions. In doing so, representations were determined by psychic reality, while others were predetermined by their interaction results, but they were positioned in the realm of consciousness, some consciousness, or beyond consciousness. All these attempts were hindered by the impossibility of objectively establishing initial data to clearly demarcate phenomena of consciousness, identify their components, determine their intensities, interdependencies, and so on. These difficulties were so significant that in the middle of the 19th century, the genuine adherence to the associationist psychology of J.S. Mill led him to make such conclusions. The phenomena of consciousness, inherently self-contained, are inaccessible to objective analysis. Even if we were to clearly distinguish the properties of images, which is not really possible, this would not save the situation, as besides external connections, physical mixing of elements exists. As stated by J.S. Mill, psychological phenomena do not look like the properties of original materials. A real, not a brute, analysis of the phenomena of consciousness is impossible. As the phenomena of consciousness themselves, so the change in them serve as indicators of brain activity. Therefore, the study of consciousness phenomena does not constitute an independent science, but can only serve as an indirect indicator of physiological processes, an auxiliary method for the real physiology of the brain. Since such physiology during J.S. Mill's time was not yet available, he agreed to recognize psychology as lawful, but only provisionally noteworthy. These pessimistic conclusions by J.S. Mill were quite justified, but they did not open up new possibilities, and importantly, they were soon overtaken by far-reaching new perspectives of psychological research that emerged in the mid-19th century. The possibilities brought into psychology by the development of experiments in psychophysiology were invaluable. Although initially these were primarily physiological experiments, in which the sensations themselves served not so much as the object of research, but as indicators of the physiological process, they showed over time to elevate physiological processes to the central nervous system processes that form an integral occurrence of consciousness phenomena in such a way that from the perspective of the brain, approaching the objective study of the most psychological processes became possible. The identification of investigators as such was considered principally impossible before, since physiological psychology, as termed by W. Wundt, across the world, evolved into a network of physiological, neurophysiological, psychophysiological, and then its own experimental psychological studies. The more experience accumulated from such studies, the greater the clarification. The precision of physiological methods discussed the ambiguity of subjective psychological indicators and interpretations. And without comparing with the immediate consciousness, physiological indicators showed a diminishing psychological significance. The characteristic physicality of these phenomena became a defining feature. It is noteworthy that intensive empirical psychophysiological research started in the 1960s. In the mid-1970s, experimental psychological methods emerged. Laboratories soon followed, and then entire institutes. But already within 25-30 years, by the mid-1990s, voices began to loudly declare the expanding opportunities in scientific possibilities for such psychology. And a decade and a half later, at the beginning of the second decade of our century, these voices merged into a loud and clear crisis of psychology. The greatest historical merit of physiological psychology remains the introduction of the experiment into psychology. But in the form it was adopted in physiological psychology, the experiment relied on a naive idea of psychophysical parallelism, and naturally could not lead psychology out of the subjective mire. The greatest achievement of this research was the emergence and development of idealistic representations about the psyche. In physiological psychology, this became a major, if not the dominant, force. The first period of this crisis seemed productive. New directions not only pointed out the existing deficiencies of physiological psychology, but also suggested new paths for psychological research. Among these directions, behaviorism had a fundamental importance. It recognized psychology as a science of behavior. Behaviorism decisively and directly demanded changes in the very subject of psychology, refusing to study phenomena of consciousness, focusing only on behavior as an objective process and only through objective methods. Behavior as a subject of psychology. Primarily, behaviorism intertwined with zoopsychology, where, since the 90s of the previous century, researchers had moved from naive interpretations of animal behavior by analogy with humans to systematic descriptions of how animals behave in experimental situations, where they solve various tasks, learning to open latches, finding ways through mazes, or finding exits from enclosed spaces, using various means, etc. Tasks could be broadly varied in nature and complexity. One could evoke different activities, different behavioral responses, rewards and punishments, causing some organs to feel or excluding some of them, applying various motor possibilities of animals, etc. The description of behavior and learning of animals under these conditions could be objectively described without resorting to conjectures about what the animal feels, thinks, or wants. The material was comprehensive, diverse, rich, it seemed, had found an objective way to study psychology that was indisputably related to psychology and was absolutely essential for it. And when in human psychology there was a profound disillusionment in the scientific possibilities of physiological psychology, naturally the idea arose to shift to humans the methods that had governed themselves so effectively in the more challenging, for objective research, area of animal psychology, shifting from studying human phenomena from states of consciousness to effective study of behavior. Thus emerged the latter, the third understanding of the subject matter of psychology, behavior. It was openly and emphatically declared at the very beginning of the second decade of our century. Human and animal behavior has such great and obvious importance for understanding their psyches. This was recognized by everyone, at all times, that when behavior was declared the legitimate subject of psychology, promising the opportunity for objective investigation, this was universally accepted as a breakthrough. According to a historian, from that point on, all psychologists, to a greater or lesser extent, became behaviorists, more or less in the sense that, recognizing behavior as the main object of study, they did not all and not invariably renounce the study of consciousness phenomena. But with behavior as the subject of psychology, the constancy of its surroundings posed problems. Although behavior is objective, its psychological content, psychological according to the criteria then assumed and now recognized by psychology, turned out to be just as unattainable for objective registration as the phenomena of consciousness. Using film, filmograms, electromyograms, electroencephalograms, etc., one could only register physical and physiological changes, body movements, its organ functions, heartbeat, their blocks, nerve blocks, secretory reactions, etc. But movement, and more so other changes in the organism, is still not behavior. Naturally, they somehow testify to behavior, but this is not a direct indication. Movement happens so often to occur, correlate with behavioral goals, with how the subject understands the circumstances, paths, and means to achieve their goals. Without such understanding, physical and physiological changes do not constitute behavior and appear to the naive observer as their non-mediated interpretation, an indirect perception. When a strict scientific requirement is presented to show behavior, not just movement, glandular, secretory, electrical and other reactions, then it turns out that besides these actions, behaviorism can show nothing more. And it cannot do this because of the inadequacies of technical means and methods of research, but because of the very essence of behavior. The impossibility of physically, materially capturing something more than various bodily reactions leads only to a broader psychological analysis of behavior, but furthermore, they cannot yield psychological depth or real behavior in psychological terms. Behavior is already not equivalent to reactions of internal organs, stomach and intestines, heart and blood vessels, liver and kidneys, etc., or from physical movements, machine operations. If behavior is a complex of physical reactions, then the reactions of internal organs are also various types of behavior. From this point of view, behavior can also be called the workings of technical devices. Representatives of the exact sciences readily use the word behavior to describe the actions of these various systems and mechanisms. They know well what is meant by this term in their field, and for them, the word behavior is nothing more than a metaphor, a handy expression. But for psychological theory, such a metaphor is a serious danger because the psychologist is precisely dealing with what is supposedly metaphorically termed here. And it does not know what constitutes behavior beyond what is in itself, and in the precise sense of the word, it is not behavior. If every movement and even change is behavior, then the latter does not constitute the subject of psychology. And if in behavior, as the subject of psychology, there is something else beyond movements or changed bodies, what exactly is it? Secondly, another apparent inconsistency in behaviorism was found in the desire to study behavior without the phenomena of consciousness, which supposedly radically disrupt the objectivity of research. Representatives of behaviorism were faced with a tough choice. Either switch to studying physiological mechanisms of behavior, i.e., become physiologists and say that there is no psychology anymore, or continue without physiological mechanisms, i.e., as if the correlation of stimuli and reactions alone was sufficient. Naturally, such foundational dichotomy of behaviorism chose the second path. However, it was not possible to simply discount physiological mechanisms essential for behavior. Some attempt to exclude centralized physiological explanation from behaviorism emerged from behavior analysis, and the desired justification was found in the form of the famous behaviorist hypothesis about the work of the brain, according to the principle of switching weaker neural processes by simultaneously projecting stronger ones. According to this so-called theory of inhibition, psychology behaviorism indeed did not bear a psychological nature. This was the fundamental position of classical behaviorism. But very soon, already by the end of the 1920s, it became clear that behavior of a human or animal could not be explained by a mere combination of individual stimuli and past experience. That between the action of stimuli and behavioral reactions, there occurs some active processing of incoming information, which cannot be linked directly to past experience. That these are some active processes for which no account fails to explain animal reaction to present stimuli. This led to the emergence of the unavoidable prism with the significant notion of intervening or intermediate variables, which marked the main problem. Such was the fundamental notion of classical behaviorism. But very soon, it became evident that one cannot explain either human or animal behavior solely by a combination of specific stimuli and past experiences. What occurs between the action of stimuli and behavioral reactions is some active processing of the incoming information, which cannot be directly tied to previous experiences. These are some active processes that one cannot account for in explaining an animal's reaction to present stimuli. Thus arose the unavoidable prism with the significant concept of intervening or intermediate variables noted as the main issue. The initial position of the foundational behaviorism often referred to as naive, openly declared itself at the very beginning of the second decade of our century. But how, through unavoidable behaviorism, recognizing these intervening variables, could it be distinguished from physiology of the brain? The solution was found in some explaining these intervening variables. It turns out they were our long-known entities: sign, symbolic structure, symbols of objects, expectation of means to an end, conclusion, inference, etc. Clearly, all these are psychological characteristics, yet everyone assures that, in essence, in the brain, this is not directly observable psychology. For significant observability, a whole new vocabulary of terminology is required, which does not have its equivalent in physiological phenomena. Naturally, the very foundation of the intervening variables has its physiological basis. However, as long as they remain only physiological processes, they should be studied physiologically, not psychologically, as they are not signs, expectations, nor conclusions. When they act as psychological processes, then as psychological reflections of situations, they require a new theory and explanation from psychological research and observation. Speaking of the need to account for intervening variables, again, puts neo-behaviorists before a choice. Either only physiology, which then lacks the genuine psychological characteristics of intervening variables, or not only physiology, but also psychology. Where, then, is the possibility for actual psychological and, at the same time, objective research? Intervening variables establish, so to speak, an unwanted and theoretically incorrect psychological analysis for behavior. Continuing in the theory to deny the significance of psychology, neo-behaviorism in practice turns out to recognize a real part of psychology in behavior and to use its psychological characteristics. In short, as a new theory about the subject of psychology, neo-behaviorism twice proved inconsistent. It could not derive the psychological content of behavior and could not explain behavior without the help of traditional psychological intervening variables. The persistent denial of behaviorists of psychology and its study was driven by fear of some kind of subjective and another kind of uncertainty. As rightly pointed out by C.J. Rubinstein, what behaviorism knew and recognized was only an idea of psychology, which it considered an emblem of knowledge. Naturally, this was not its specialty. Such an idea about the psychology of behaviorism differed from all the cluttered philosophy and psychologies. Probably, for that reason, it did not occur to the representatives of behaviorism that what was unintentional was not psychology itself, but this complex idea about it, and it is precisely this unintentional and denatured representation that should be excluded from psychology. Paragraph 3. Development of views on psychological activity in Soviet psychology. The subject of psychology and psychological activity are not one and the same, but the concepts about them are closely related. Understanding the nature and development of psychological activity, enhanced by the theoretical and experimental development in the works of Soviet psychologists, contributed to the formation of the concept of psychology that we attempt to further explore in this introduction. It should be noted that in Soviet psychology, the question of its subject did not receive special attention. The initial, complex, and difficult period of its establishment, the 1920s, saw the struggle between materialism against idealism, which dominated official psychology before the revolution. Only in this general methodological context were discussions about replacing subjective idealistic psychology with reflexology or reactology considered. Even in the discussions of 1971 to 1972, when the question about the subject of psychology was directly raised, the debate revolved around what actually constitutes this subject, and which part of the traditional understanding of the subject of psychology can be preserved under the pressure of computational mathematics and cybernetics, which seem to increasingly overshadow and, from some perspectives, even completely push aside the cognitive functions in psychology. Following the first All-Union Congress on the Study of Human Behavior, 1930, in Soviet psychology, there was a broadening of the subject of psychology in the form of guidelines for our sensations, feelings, representations, thoughts, well known to every person from their own experience. This approach seems to resemble the definition of psychology, which is supported by adherents of empirical and physiological psychology, distinctly marking Soviet psychological science with a unique character. From the standpoint of the main positions of dialectical and historical materialism about consciousness, it was argued that our sensations and thoughts are directed toward activity. It included the principal limitation of introspective methods, self-observation, in subject-object relations in studies of thoughts, desires, etc. The preservation of subject and object expression in the functions of objective connections, physical and physiological bases, etc., was considered. Subjective actions were only regarded as one of the resistances to these processes, and not the most important, yet considerable attention in specific studies was devoted to them. In Soviet psychology, especially great importance was given to the general understanding of psychology as a historical materialist conception of consciousness and activity of people. In everyday psychology, consciousness is characterized first by some general quality of all cognizable phenomena, as if light in which they all appear, and secondly, consciousness is the possession of these phenomena, as if co-living one's psychological activity. Differing from historical materialism, consciousness develops as a specific feature of human psychology, formulated within the system of social relations. On the basis of language and different forms of social organization, psychology is supported by the activity of social consciousness and the actual lives of people, significantly highlighting the role of consciousness in activities aligned with their social existence and the understanding of objective conditions and tasks of their activity, which, as V.I. Lenin stated, consciousness of man not only reflects the objective world, but also creates it. Understanding consciousness as an essential component of active behavior corresponds to the corresponding changes that extend across all species, including psychological activity in animals. However, in animals, this activity is limited only to adaptations to the surrounding world, yet still constitutes an active, not passive adaptation, defined only by the combination of stimuli and ready-made response mechanisms. This general understanding of psychology from the position of dialectical and historical materialism is receiving increasingly profound theoretical and experimental development. For its theoretical justification, especially important were the concepts of J.C. Vygotsky on the origin and nature of higher psychological functions, and the studies of A.N. Leontiev and J.L. Rubinstein about the relationship of psychology to the meaningful external subject matter activity, which received the name Problems of Activity in Psychology. The basic idea of J.C. Vygotsky's concept was that higher mental functions originated as social relations, objectified in human activity. For humans, these functions are mediated by established symbols and methods of application, whereas for animals, their activity is determined by instinctive mechanisms of interaction with the external environment. Specifically for humans, higher psychological functions arise from forms of verbal interaction among people and mediated by signs, most of all by language signs. They develop in the process of learning, i.e., in the joint activity of a child and adults. Therefore, education, whether organized or informal, represents a common thread of psychological development, and psychological activity is a product of both inner cognitive processes and the surrounding external activity. These general positions of Vygotsky received decisive support in experimental studies by A.N. Leontiev, which were dedicated to the development of mediated attention. In these experiments, it was established that the studied younger age group could not use signs to organize their psychological activities, while the middle-aged groups could fully utilize such tools, but only those previously provided to them. Older children were not dependent on the external means provided, such as schematic representations. They instead developed psychological tools that sharply increased attention effectiveness and memory capabilities. If we highlight crucial points that combine effectiveness indicators at these levels, we get a well-known picture of the paradigm of development of investigations. In the tradition of French sociological school, it was argued that social representations integrate and become representations of individual human beings, which Vygotsky did not originally envisage as the objective forms of verbal communication in the process of real, practical, material, and joint activity. The ideal side of formal structures of language, the meaning of words that gradually become established by the child in this actual activity, cooperates with adults, and the child's psychological development proceeds along with the expansion and deepening of their relationships with the world, transforming their leading activity. In the mentioned psychological directions, cognition was always considered as inherently internal. Thus, many progressive representatives of these directions uniquely recognized the legitimacy of studying psychological phenomena through the exploration of parallel physiological processes. Something notably different was observed in Vygotsky's teachings, emphasizing the transformative nature of human activity, which later became a basis for higher psychological functions, eventually transforming into intrapsychic, subjective forms. Finally, the elusive, yet critically studied pathway of this transformation was called internalization. These positions developed into the cornerstone of psychology, setting new tasks and outlining novel pathways for theoretical thought and experimental research. In the activity problems, a deeper understanding of the principal question emerged, seen only hinted at in the works of J.C. Vygotsky about the relationship of psychological activity to external, object-related activity of the subject. Contrary to behaviorism, Soviet psychology emphasized the meaningfulness of human activity, stressing that meaningfulness is not only not limited to consciousness, but pervades it entirely. A.N. Leontiev and S.I. Rubinstein emphasized that the origin of psychological activity is not only from forms of communication, but also from other forms of human activity. Moreover, not just the emergence from these forms, but their further existence, so to speak, within external activity as its own psychological mechanism. This was also supported by the variety of dependence of psychology on these external forms of activity. In other words, psychological activity not only builds upon external material activity, but includes aspects of this external activity, enriching it and imbuing it with new possibilities, for instance, mediated interaction, depending on and evolving from its place within the structure of this external activity. The diverse theoretical and experimental evidence for these positions was devoted to the studies of many Soviet psychologists in the 30s-60s. Thus, during the life of the entire generation, the understanding among Soviet psychologists deepened considerably, leading to the belief that understanding psychological activity should be sought precisely in relation to external material activity. The specification of the fundamental positions of dialectical and historical materialism concerning the mind also led to the accumulation of significant factual material in numerous experimental studies. These facts are significant for our understanding of the problem, defining the subject of psychology, which can be divided into three groups. First, data on the favorable similarity of conditions from which the success of both psychological processes and external activity depends. This especially relates to such psychological functions, the mechanisms of which are least related to any external activity. For example, in manifestations of memory, as presented by researchers like A.H. Leontiev, P.I. Zinchenko, A.A. Smirnov, in forming habits, in studies by L.M. Vecker, V.N. Asnin, A.N. Sokolova, and particularly in a large series of works by A.V. Zaporozhets and D.B. Elkonin, among others. Secondly, data obtained in various fields initially gave rise to a comprehensive understanding and mechanisms of mental activity that seemed to mirror such external activity, but as a result of its reduction, whether or not knowingly, became something unrecognizable and unknown, yet unquestionably more effective. Various effective facts of such changes were established in investigations led by B.M. Teplov and P.A. Shevarev. This contraction leads to the fact that what was initially comprehensible in terms of content and mechanisms of mental activity subsequently reconstructs similar external activity. The following stages became clearly discernible: an external activity, more or less developed in response to external incentives, its reduction and automation, which in self-observation leaves only an indefinite feeling of some process and its result. When comparing these successive forms, the thought itself is strained about the process of a given, already completely liberated psychological process from this very task, but fully containing the essence, internal, objectified, meaningful activity. Furthermore, these data, illuminating the same process, the formation of a specific psychological phenomenon, have shown that the beginning is easier to perform on metacognition, difficult in intense reflection and struggle within the self, about oneself, in oneself. These three stages of developmental difficulty are successive stages of learning, especially notable in preschool and early school years. Later relationships become not very stable. Middle, dissipation of efforts, rarely appears as insubstantial, and then the whole process loses genetic connection, with it the principal significance. For understanding the subject of psychology, as further developed in this introduction, the studies by A.N. Leontiev about the transformation of sensory perceptions into the shared, and the investigations by A.B. Zaporozhets about the role of organized orientation activity for the formation of physical and subsequently perceptual actions are especially significant. Later research by D.B. Elkonin about the formation of various types of mental activities is also noteworthy. In the studies conducted under the leadership of A.B. Zaporozhets, and interesting for us from the viewpoint of understanding, it is essential to highlight the work of P.I. Zinchenko on the formation of interruptible action, processed by looking for a path in the labyrinth. In these most common experiments, the results boil down to the fact that initially the child learns to proceed through the labyrinth with the help of eye movement under visual control, and only after starting to master this does the opportunity open up for him to transition to performing an analogous task using a single glance. The evolution of this interruptible action is particularly interesting. It initially copies the path of the hand, then starts to create more and more parts of the labyrinth for checkpoints, through walls, ending with a movement from the exit point towards the entrance. However, this movement paradoxically increases the inaccessibility or complicates understanding of the essential features of the initial labyrinth structure. In this research, special attention is paid to the fact that the final form of interruptible action bears no resemblance to its original form, and even more so to its material new form. If the process of its formation and its transformation along this path are unknown, then distinguishing its actual action from its content, and even more so, its origins, becomes impossible. From the numerous studies of D.B. Elkonin, we will briefly focus on two. The first, his well-known study, focuses on the role of motor components in the process of overall perception. The method of teaching early reading consists in that the word to be read is represented by an image of the object it denotes. For analyzing the phonetic composition of the word, a diagram consisting of horizontal rows, for the number of sounds in the word, is used. Sounds are sequentially highlighted, and the cells are filled with letters. Immediately after this, the middle sound changes to another, then the third, and so on, and the child pronounces this new sound as part of the previous ones. The diagram of the object becomes a tool for sound analysis and synthesis of the current speech material. M.B. Gamez's research, conducted under the guidance of D.B. Elkonin, quickly led to the formation of a new understanding and together with it a new image, a purposeful acquaintance with a task, material questioning of the object, its outline from a close distance. But this only opens the discussion of its characteristics when concluding its character, completing the same process already about itself, yet still in separate stages, and only finally, completing all operations with in itself, resulting only in a conclusive end. If we combine the results of the cited research, they would constitute a significant part of what will later be explored in this introduction. Special significance was had by A.N. Leontiev's studies on transforming sensory perceptions into the shared, A.B. Zaporozhets's research on organizing directed activity for the formation of physical and later perceptual actions, and D.B. Elkonin's studies on forming various kinds of mental activities. These works began with the unraveling of traditional research methods of so-called creative thinking. This led me to a rather trivial conclusion: the possibilities of rationale and therefore productive solutions to significant tasks depend considerably on the prior acquisition of knowledge and skills. Consequently, the first task is to ensure the formation of these knowledges and skills with the desired characteristics. The realization of this requirement led to the modification of the existing educational system. From now on, it was necessary to either register the process in certain or altered conditions, or to modify these conditions so that they ensure the formation of the desired actions, and with them, representation and understanding of the objects of these actions, with certain properties. The system of conditions ensuring the formation of knowledge and skills, with the designated properties, turned out to be quite complex, diverse, and requiring clear, meticulous methodological application. Compared to the conditions that are considered even in advanced research today, they seem disjointed, insufficiently connected, and the learning process itself more directed than managed. Using the full system of necessary conditions makes the process of formation much easier and quicker, and the spread of success becomes more apparent. In the predominant method of forming new knowledge and skills, these two functions of images or combinations, fixating on a single object, perception, representation, recognition, and then laboriously differentiating or acting between the object and its knowledge, are manifested. Knowledge thus serves as a variant relative to the possibilities of its utilization, directed toward its orienting function. The latter relates entirely to psychological activity, and in these conditions it remains as fluid as in all other cases. Apparently, this explains the paradoxical fact that the process of forming knowledge and skills in lived experience, school education, or laboratory research until now has not allowed for the necessary content of this psychological activity to be discussed. Significantly different is the position that takes place when the formation of a specific psychological phenomenon is organized with the full system of necessary conditions, the so-called preliminary knowledge and skills, and with floating processing of worldly experiences. The system means that the way of interacting with objects, for the purposes of their knowledge, use, transformation, can be presented in a record or an image on a card for easy use. Then, after a brief preliminary clarification, these instructions can be directly applied in action. This opens the possibility, first, to perform very complex actions, which without such external support could have been executed correctly and thoroughly. Secondly, if such an orienting card exists, it can reproduce its content in action. In the end, the actual orienting activity, so necessary in the process of establishing new actions and images, narrows down in the process of automatization. This leads to the formalism of formality. On the surface, in appearance, only the final result of the process remains. This may be a certain image, for example, the path of some calculated formula, a certain vision of the card, or a certain action, for example, writing a word, painting a board, spotting a detail. As for the learner, most notably in the final stage of this process, it seems as if the accepted task is completed immediately, or another result is achieved. The real psychological complexity of the mechanisms of this type of activity and the neurophysiological mechanisms of specific brain functions remain unexplored. This illusion only disappears under the following conditions. If we fully understand the entire process of forming this particular product, the history of forming, the orienting activity itself, which answers to a new role of knowledge, and together with it the process of forming the action and its final product. If we know all the differentiators as both orienting and executing parts of the action, all the educational transitions they undergo when moving from one stage to another, thus we can understand and evaluate the role of orienting activity of the subject at every step of this process. If we observe the successive changes of the very orienting activity in the process of formation, and then in the process of applying complex actions and images, and this is evident only with clearly organized floating formation. Considering all these data, we gain the ability to approach the development of the very psychological content from such a multifaceted object as psychological activity, leading to questions about the subject of psychology.